Let me start by quoting a sentence from Article 1 of the Treaty of the European Union. Quote, "The treaty marks a new stage in the process of creating an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, in which decisions are taken as openly as possible and as closely as possible to the citizen." End of quote. So, taking the sentence as authoritative, we can easily decipher the meaning of the phrase ever closer union. It refers to a progressive growth of supranational institutions, now called the European Union, gradually taking competences from the member states so that those institutions serve people better. This interpretation of the sentence is corroborated by the series of European treaties, starting with the Treaty of Paris and culminating in the recent proposals for a treaty change. With each treaty, the competences of the EU institutions become stronger and stronger. Now, if that is what this phrase means, we can see that the quoted sentence contains a glaring contradiction. One cannot have it both ways. On the one hand, an ever closer union, and on the other, a system in which the decisions are taken openly and closely to the citizen. It's either or. Either we build a huge supranational institutions and then we are close and then we are as remote from, as inaccessible to the citizens as possible, or we want to be close to the citizens, and then we must resolutely oppose supranational bureaucratic hypermonsters. The claim that the European Commission can be closer and more open to the citizens than the government of a member state offends human intelligence. So whoever wants to reform the European Union to make the EU more humane and workable should start by scrapping the quoted paragraph and banishing the ever closer union concept from the political discourse. But this is just the beginning. The phrase conveys more poisonous presuppositions. The quoted sentence implies that the creation of the Union is a process. Some theologically sensitive Euro enthusiasts could say that it is a secular version of creatio continua. However, the idea that the building of the Union is a continuous process is not only nonsense, but dangerous nonsense. It goes against everything we managed to learn about the proper functioning of the state. The whole point in creating a political construction is that it should be stable, not volatile, that the competences between the constituent parts are clear and unbreachable, not blurred and dynamic, that the emphasis is put on the existence of safeguards against the misuse of power, on checks and balances, and not on giving some bodies instruments to expand their power at the expense of other bodies. The ever closer union concept reversed these propositions. Since the union, as it is believed, will continue to shift power from the member states to the European institutions, and since this process is claimed to be desirable, the ever closer union is nothing less than an encouragement to accelerate the process. Straining, sidestepping, and even violating the existing rules in this direction is not only tolerated, but encouraged. From the ever closer union perspective, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, and the European Parliament that go beyond their competences do what must be done anyway. And the fact that they do it sooner than the treaty is officially endorsed is to their credit, and we should be all grateful to them. This cavalier, if not outright contemptuous, attitude to the European treaties is therefore not something that has appeared recently, nor is it a symptom of general deterioration of public morality. Such lawlessness is a legitimate consequence of the entire conception of political integration. If the American Constitution had stipulated an ever closer union with the implication that gradually the competences of the states would be transferred to Washington, to the federal government, we should have had the same results. We should therefore not be surprised that the existing restraints in the treaties are ignored. Article 5 of the Treaty of the European Union enumerates 3 principles that the EU should respect: subsidiarity, proportionality, and conferral. The last one is particularly important. European institutions have only those competences that the member states confer upon them. Article 5 is completely dead. To my knowledge, never in its history has the European Court of Justice invoked it against the unfounded claims of the European institutions, nor do I know of any instance of the court's ruling in favor of the nation state against the Commission in important matters. This is not the end of the problem. Since the change goes in one direction, and this one direction is inscribed in the constitution of the European structure, then it follows that only certain political parties are legitimate. In light of this concept, European politics is not a world of alternatives and choices, but a world of necessity. The groups that question this direction of change are not and cannot be legitimate, as they contradict the basis of the European doctrine. They are not partners or political rivals or antagonists or members of the honorable opposition, but enemies that should be neutralized and removed outside the boundary of political respectability and stigmatized as populist or nationalist or far-right or fascist. Do we know what form the ever closer union will ultimately take? No, we don't. However, we know that the goal of integration exists in the future at some remote point in time when people will agree that the integration process has been completed. In practical terms, however, it is a receding point. There is no clear plan indicating the conditions which, when fulfilled, will mean that the integration has come to an end. And since the goal is located in the future, the concept of an ever closer union contains a substantial element of faith. We must have faith in something that is coming but has not materialized itself yet. To be a good EU man, one needs saltus fidei, a secular leap in faith, which in turn forbids one to doubt. Raising doubts is like a sin, a secular sin, obviously. And those that dare to question faith are unrepentant and unrepentable heretics. This is one of the paradoxes of our time. The modern men, seeing themselves as progressive, forward-looking, open-minded, tolerant, enlightened, unbiased, permissive, and unbigoted, teaching others to be critical and skeptical, are in fact the opposite of what they preach. The list of taboos and dogmas with respect to which no skepticism or criticism is allowed is surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, long. Yes, they say, one should be skeptical and critical, but then they add, not about ever closer union, because Euroscepticism is a sin. Not about the concept of gender, not about abortion, not about same-sex marriage, not about CO2 emissions, etc., etc. The doctrinaire and dogmatic part of the EU ideology is quite considerable and still growing. When compared to today's progressive medieval monks, look almost like intellectual anarchists. The belief in the ever closer union would not have survived without the constant chants about how blessed we are on our way to European unity and how our bliss will be increasing with every step of integration. But this faith is utterly unfounded, at least when one looks at the functioning of the EU and its mechanisms that push integration forward. It's true that the European institutions have been increasing their power, but since they have little democratic legitimacy, this growth of power does not stem from people's endorsement of their authority. It is the big players, the most powerful member states, particularly the governments of Germany and France, that allow the European institutions to grab new competences. From the beginning, this process of integration has been essentially a West European enterprise, with the West European political mainstream playing the dominant role. This was the role these countries both chose, but also this role was, so to speak, thrust upon them by Britain and the United States. As Winston Churchill said in his Zurich lecture, September 1946, when he called upon the European nations to create the United States of Europe, and let me quote Winston Churchill, "In this urgent work," he said, "France and Germany must take the lead together. Great Britain, the British Commonwealth of Nations, mighty America, and I trust Soviet Russia must be the friends and sponsors of the new Europe and must champion its right to live," unquote. It is true that this self-proclaimed and conferred upon leadership implies that the European institutions' growth of power will result in the creation of some kind of federal supranational government ruled by supranational political elites. But this is only a part of the story. The other part is that the more power of the institutions acquire, the more political instruments fall into the hands of the West European governments to steer European politics. Simultaneously, a different process unfolds itself in other parts of the EU. The acquisition of power by the European institutions is accompanied by restricting the sovereignty of weaker countries, mostly from Eastern and Central Europe. The immense growth of the power of European institutions over the last 2 decades was possible largely because of the big enlargement in 2004, where a number of weaker states joined the EU. The Commission, the Council, and the Parliament ceased to be a club of West European member states, relatively equal, with the political elites emerging from the same melting pot, inherently left or left-leaning, regardless of the official political and ideological label. With the new and weaker members, themselves admitting being weak and asking their Western allies for leadership, the club, naturally as it were, accepted the newcomers' inferior position and their own superior status. Some of the East and Central European politicians implored the West European governments to strengthen their leadership in the EU and thereby more or less openly and even enthusiastically accepted the inferior status of their own countries. In this new situation, the European institutions could expand their authority, they could admonish, forbid, censure, threaten, blackmail, and punish the weaker partners. And the weaker partners had no will, power, or means to react in kind. The result is that over the last 2 decades, the power of the European institutions has increased considerably, all at the expense of the weaker states of the so-called New Europe. Some argue, and I tend to agree, that there has emerged a new version of traditional colonialism, this time not external. This external colonialism has been condemned and exorcised, but internal, carried out, as in the past, in the name of progress and enlightenment. This time the savages are the conservative tribes somewhere in Warsaw, Budapest, Ljubljana, Bratislava. There are also some conservative tribes, the savages in western part of Europe. And the colonizers reside in the bureaucratic structures of Brussels, Paris, Strasbourg, Luxembourg, and other big centers of power. Fortunately, the colonizers do not have it as easy as they initially hoped. They are challenged by the growing opposition from within the West European societies and from without by the growing Eurosceptics in the Eastern and Central Europe. Sooner or later, the colonizers will live in shame and disgrace. Needless to say, the sooner, the better.